So this is the first video lecture in the unit on World War II. It's entitled Hitler's Lightning War. So if you find that section, it's the first one in your vocab sheet, and we'll go through and fill out the vocab and the terms for that. Where we left off in the Between the Wars unit, the last part was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin called the Non-Aggression Pact, not to attack each other. And there was a few subsections of this non-aggression pact, not just not attack each other, but also they agreed to divide Poland between the two of them. They just ripped it in half. Germany got the west, Russia got the east, and the Russians were invaded the Baltic states, which are some nations, some new nations created after World War I out of territory that Russia gave to Germany when they ended their involvement in the war, and Finland is a Scandinavian country that borders Russia. All right, so of this map of Europe, you can kind of see Poland there, divided in half between Germany and Soviet Union. Here's Finland and the Baltic states. All right, when Germany invaded Poland, that was like the symbolic beginning of World War II. So the German invasion of Poland started World War II. All right, also, the technique the Germans used to attack the countries we're going to look at in the early parts of the war was called the Blitzkrieg. They attacked really, really fast in a way that hopefully that their opponents couldn't mount a defense because their attack was so overwhelming and so quick. And that was the kind of the idea, kind of the same concept as a blitz in football. Try to charge through the line before the offense can do anything about it. If we go back to this map of Europe, you see there was a buffer between France and Germany after World War I that the Germans occupied, and they fortified it against each other. All right, so there was a fortification on either side. You see this red line is the German fortification, and the green line is the French fortification. And they each had a name. All right, the red one was the Siegfried line, that was the German fortification. And the green one here was the Maginot line, which is the French fortification. And the French fortification in particular was kind of interesting. So if we take some images, a second here to look at the really intricate network of tunnels that connected the above ground turrets that the French had as their fortification against Germany. So here's a cross section, an artist rendering of what it would look like. It's a pretty, like I said, intricate. You see, here's the entrance here, which is above ground. These domes are above ground. Everything else is below ground. And to get some context as to the size of this, just this massive underground layer almost. You see there's some people in this dome. You see some people outside. There's a train right here going through a section of it. So you really get the extent of how huge this network was. Now these domes on top, each dome was a gun like this with turrets that were supposed to be used as defense in case the Germans tried to get aggressive with the Germans again after World War I was over. The Germans did attack France, but they attacked the same way they attacked in World War I. They went through Belgium, the neutral country, and the place where they broke through, you can kind of see here for a second, was, I will get to that in a second. We'll get to the area for number 5 in a second. Number 4 here, I skipped. 3 nations that Hitler invaded used this Blitzkrieg technique where he took, remember last unit we already saw that he occupied the Rhineland, took Czechoslovakia, Austria, and now he took half of Poland. Well, now he's going to take these 3 nations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, all using the Blitzkrieg technique to overwhelm them before they could mount much defense. Plus, the German army was superior to them anyway, and then their technique just made it that much harder. All right, as I said, the location in Belgium that the Germans went through, they didn't go through the Maginot Line, they went around the Maginot Line, just like in World War I. And the location here where they charged through into France was called the Ardennes Forest. Extra credit points if you can find Captain America in the background, but that's just for fun. All right, another interesting location as the Germans marched to France, to the capital of France. This is a little more famous now than it was years ago, and that location in northern France is called Dunkirk. This is because the Germans were coming in from this direction, and this is the English Channel up here, and so these British troops that had crossed the English Channel and landed in France to help were trapped between the coast and the German army that was coming this way. And if you've seen the movie, it was just this all-out effort to get these troops out of there on any vessel possible so that they wouldn't be captured. And so that was a pretty significant thing. It was also an element of environment because the fog rolled in and gave them cover that that they couldn't have provided themselves. And so these English troops escaped to fight another day. Who knows how the war would have been different if those troops had been captured that day. All right, so here's a picture of getting all these troops out and whatever means was possible. All right, in the summer of 1940, France as a nation fell to Germany. This was a huge deal because France is a different country than like any of those Scandinavian nations or Poland. It was supposed to be this Western powerhouse, and the Germans just overtook them. And so that was a big deal to the rest of the world, a big eye-opener to the rest of the world. Right, the individual who led, this is a vocab word, who led the resistance to the Germans even after they came in and took over was named Charles de Gaulle. And so he led these French people to resist the Germans even after they took over the government of France. And his efforts are going to have him be the leader of France after World War II is over too. But that's in the future. Here's a couple pictures here, selfies with Hitler and his friends as he was touring through France. Here's another picture from Hitler's vacation in France, a couple of his friends walking down the street of Paris. There they are. All right, this is an interesting picture. This train right here, this is where the Treaty of Versailles was signed at the end of World War I. And it was taken out of commission, put off to the side. It's kind of like a historical monument. And when the Germans came in 1940, they forced who was left of the French government to go back into this train and signed their surrender in the exact same spot the Germans had to sign their surrender after World War I. So kind of a little purposeful spite there. All right, a couple other things. Another important part of the German military offense was their air force, that they just overwhelmed and bombarded their enemies. This is part of the Blitzkrieg, as they bombed first and then came in with the soldiers afterwards and the tanks and stuff. All right, once all of Europe, once France falls, literally the continent of Europe is either owned by Hitler or in alliance with Hitler. So the next area of emphasis was Britain. And they couldn't really land troops. It was too difficult to land troops on the coast and invade. So they decided to attack Britain in a different way. And that campaign was called the Battle of Britain. If you go up in your vocab words there, I'm going to skip the order a little bit to number 4. So this is where Germans literally every single day dropped bombs on the major cities in England, and the British did their best to fight them, but it was really just the sirens went off, the planes came, the bombs dropped, you went into a safe location, and then you came out afterwards and you tried to make your life make sense. So people could come out and maybe their home would be destroyed or their work would be destroyed, but they had to just keep going like this. And it was a difficult sort of experience that they had to endure. If you've seen, it's been a while now, but if you've seen the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the movie opens up with a bunch of kids packing into subway cars and being shipped off by their parents. Well, that was typical during World War II because the cities were being bombed. So parents put their kids on trains and sent them out to relatives to live in the country where they weren't being bombed. And so that was kind of a regular occurrence. The parents stayed and worked, but they sent their kids to a safer location. All right, Winston Churchill was the prime minister. He was the one who suggested that maybe you can't trust Hitler. Turns out he was right, and he was rewarded for being the leader, appointed as the leader of Great Britain during this conflict and a little bit afterwards. All right, shifting focus a little bit. This is another vocab word. This is the individual who is in charge of the German military machine in Africa, which is where they focused on after Europe. This is Edwin Rommel, and he's the leader of the German forces in North Africa. Also, this is the answer to question 9. What area of the Mediterranean did Hitler focus on first? And that is Africa, after he secured Europe. And the place in Africa that he focused on was Egypt. You can see it over here in the corner. It started in Egypt. This was a British territory, so this is another way of attacking the British and hopefully getting them to surrender. So all of Europe, all the way across North Africa, all owned by Hitler in the early stages of World War II. So this entire area here, Spain was neutral, so they weren't a threat. All of North Africa was taken, and the Germans went after Egypt and other British territories in the Middle East. So they really had control of the whole continent in early 1940s. And so Hitler's not a person to just be satisfied, so he probably planning this from the beginning and decided to turn on the Soviet Union. So this whole operation that they were planning, obviously for some time, even though they agreed not to, it's called Operation Barbarossa. And that was the German plan to invade the Soviet Union. So if you indulge me for a second, we skip question 11. So the city where the Soviets were cut off, city was cut off in hopes to surrender, is what they did is they abandoned the city. They completely pulled out all the people, and when the Germans got there, nobody was there, no resources were there, and they were able to overwhelm the Germans by being so deep into Russia without the ability to replenish their supplies. The technique they use is the same thing they used in World War I. You can see it up at the top here. It's called the scorched earth technique. Destroy everything and retreat further into Russia, and then when the Germans got there, they couldn't replenish their supplies. And that actually worked in World War I, and it worked in World War II too, also. So the reasons why this didn't work, the Germans, why this invasion didn't work, why it didn't work with Napoleon, why it didn't work in World War I, is Germans expected this to be done super quick, so they weren't dressed. They weren't prepared for the environmental conditions that existed in Russia once winter hit. Also, like I mentioned, they didn't learn from history. They didn't learn Napoleon, who was a great general, had a similar struggle in trying to attack Russia. There's so much land, and it's so big, it's hard to take. And also, it was a point of pride. Hitler had made several public statements about how inferior communism was, so he couldn't just retreat because that would look bad. And when you're a dictator, image is a really, really important part of keeping control. So that's the beginning of a downfall for Hitler invading the Soviet Union. All right, the United States is an ocean away, not involved here, but there's some. I'm going to quickly summarize the 3 stages to American involvement in this war. So number 1, they totally isolationist. They're not going to trade with anybody. They're not. That's how they got sucked into World War I. No trading, no lending. We're by ourselves. You figure it out. That was step A. And then as Germany got more success and more territory, the policy changed to, okay, we'll sell only to the Allies. It's got to be in cash, and you have to bring and load your own ships because we're not going to get sunk in the Atlantic again and get sucked into this war. So that was phase 2. But then the Germans kept going even more, and then when France fell, it became pretty obvious that eventually Germany would face a problem to the United States. So the involvement changed again. They could lend or lease any amount of arms to the Allies to just take it and pay us for it later. So they wouldn't send any troops, but they're sending a massive amount of supplies to Europe in order to help the British in particular stand up against Hitler. All right, and then last but not least, last vocab word here. Even though the United States wouldn't declare war on Germany, President Roosevelt here and Prime Minister Stalin had a sort of verbal alliance. It was called the Atlantic Charter. That's our last vocab word. And this is an agreement, a written agreement of similar goals between Roosevelt and Churchill. So they weren't going to fight. The United States wasn't going to fight with Great Britain. They weren't going to send over troops. They weren't going to declare war. But they were going to have this document saying that we're philosophically, ideologically on the same side. So that was as much involvement as the United States was prepared to be at this point.